In Sri Lanka, with reports coming of security forces dismantling the protest site, the question is the more things change, the more they remain the same. I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Our top focus this evening is on what's happening in the troubled island, where security forces have stepped in to forcibly remove demonstrators from outside the president's quarters. Now, journalists are complaining, including journalists from the BBC, that security forces have beaten up the media and forced them, in certain cases, to delete the video and the images and interviews that they had filmed. You are seeing some of those images coming in from Sri Lanka late last night. Today, of course, Sri Lanka has got itself a new prime minister, but both with the president and the prime minister, the question being asked on the street is whether these are two men who continue to remain extremely close or have been close to the Rajapaksas, who have, of course, fallen from grace into disgrace. Ranil Wickremesinghe tried to assure the people of Sri Lanka by saying he did not stand with the Rajapaksas, he stood with the people of Sri Lanka. But are the people buying this? In all of this turmoil, India says that we stand with the people of Sri Lanka. China is trying to disassociate itself from the Rajapaksas, whom it has personally funded in the past. Geopolitics and turmoil on the ground. To make sense of all of it, we'll have a panel of experts as well as voices from Sri Lanka today. And let us introduce our guests one by one. Welcoming to the program is author and journalist Fidel Fernando, joining us from Colombo. Thank you very much, Fidel, for being with us. Also from Sri Lanka today, Jehan Perera. He's with the National Peace Council. As you can see in those images, there are power cuts in Sri Lanka. And thank you, Jehan, for using some of your emergency lights to make this broadcast possible. Appreciated. Padma Rao, a veteran journalist who spent a lot of time on the ground in recent days and weeks covering Sri Lanka, independent editor, is with us. Also joining us is Meenakshi Ganguly, just back from Sri Lanka. Meenakshi is the South Asia director with the Human Rights Watch. And also with us is veteran diplomat, Ambassador Dilip. So thank you very much. And I'd like to start with our friends from Sri Lanka. Jehan, the last time we were talking, you had concerns, there was emergency in place. Now your country has a new president, a new prime minister, and protesters are being forced off the streets. Your thoughts today?
Yeah, what happened this morning, early morning, and actually in midnight, came as a considerable surprise. We didn't expect this because we thought that the new president, who has liberal credentials, the man who tried to negotiate with the Tamil Tigers 20 years ago and brought in the Norwegian facilitators to do that, we thought that he would try and have some sort of dialogue with the protest movement, because it is this protest movement that has brought him to power in the first place. He is a man who only had a single seat in a 225 parliament. Despite that, he was appointed prime minister by former President Rajapaksa. Now, the parliament has elected him as the president of Sri Lanka. So he, in a way, he has to try and dialogue with the general public, because they did not vote him into power. But what we are seeing is that perhaps as a reflection of that lack of empathy with the people, he has directed them. I believe he has directed the military to engage in this very repressive practice. I just met some of my colleagues, including a Christian priest who had tried to enter the scene yesterday. He had tried to go to the site of which had come under attack, and there were barricades, and the military said, no, you cannot go, although they were Christian priests and Buddhist monks together. And then when a lawyer had tried to argue with the military there, they had assaulted the lawyer in front of my colleagues, the priests who were there. So I'm really very, very upset about what I'm deeply anguished, because this protest movement, these young people who are being attacked this way, they represent us. They represent what we want in our country, for our country. And we are helpless. We couldn't go there. And now they are, some of them are missing. Yes.
Yeah. And Fidel, if you'd like to join what Jehan has said, the irony is that the protests were meant to be about change. But at this moment, with two men in government, both seen by many in Sri Lanka to be close to the disgraced Rajapaksas, has anything fundamentally changed at all there?
Yeah, I mean, it hasn't essentially. I think there is almost a fatigue within the protest movement now because it has been going for 3 months. They've asked for substantial political change, and they've got rid of a prime minister and a president, which is something that has never happened in Sri Lanka. From in a movement like this, Parliament has never impeached a president or a prime minister, for example, and a protest movement was able to accomplish that. But they've ended up with somebody who, Gotabaya Rajapaksa allowed these protests to happen in Goalface because he had to deal with certain political realities, and he, at the very least, they were not dismantled by force with violence the way we've seen today. But under Ranil Wickremesinghe, in the first 24 hours of his presidency, he has dismantled them in brutal and vicious fashion, as Mr. Perera just outlined there. Where I would perhaps depart with Mr. Perera is that I don't think that it was much of a surprise. Ranil Wickremesinghe last week labeled this protest movement as a fascist movement. When journalists were beaten up outside of his house on July 9th, he then explained that as there's videos of journalists being beaten up by forces, and he said that they merely fell. And so I don't think that while he has certain liberal credentials that are often cited by many kind of civil society and also by the international community, I think the thing that we have to understand about Ranil Wickremesinghe is that, and something we've seen over the past few months, is that power is his main objective and his only objective. And we've
you're actually, sorry, I'm stepping in there. You're actually saying that in some ways, Gotabaya Rajapaksa allowed these protests with a little more tolerance than Wickremesinghe, though I suppose the government in Sri Lanka would argue that there's a new president, a new prime minister, and so Sri Lanka has to get on with it. That would be their logic, I suppose.
Yes, and that would be fine logic if the protesters themselves had not volunteered to leave this site by 2 p.m. today. They were anyway going to leave. Many of the tents had been cleared out. Many of the people had begun to take those steps back. In the last couple of weeks, on July 9th, we saw people take the presidential palace. We saw a few days later, we saw them take the prime minister's office. The temple trees, the prime minister's residence was also taken, and protesters voluntarily withdrew from all of those places. It's not as if they were at this big standoff that required this kind of military force. So for Ranil Wickremesinghe, when 2 p.m. today, the protesters had already voluntarily said that they were going to leave this site and allow whatever agenda Wickremesinghe was going to follow to carry on. He still, you have to wonder why that is, and what kind of power game is going on here for him to take this extraordinary step.
Before I bring in Meenakshi and Padma for more on what's happening on the ground, Ambassador Dilip Sinha, India has said that we stand with the people of Sri Lanka. What does this exactly mean at a time when, even with the changes in government, the government is distinctly unpopular with the mood on the street? It's quite evident. Even after these changes, you've heard our two friends from Sri Lanka speak. You're seeing security forces, the Sri Lankan security forces have not done this before. They've actually steered clear of any direct confrontation with the protesters up until this moment. What should India be doing?
Well, I think what India is doing is absolutely correct. Its stand that we stand with the people of Sri Lanka is absolutely correct, because Sri Lanka is going through a revolution, and this revolution is a remarkable revolution in that one, it is been largely peaceful, and it is genuinely a people's movement. Now, the previous regime, the Rajapaksa regime, was neither working for the people of Sri Lanka, nor was it working for friendship with a country like India, which is its largest neighbor and has been the closest neighbor all through history. In this situation, for India, India has to wait and see how the situation evolves in Sri Lanka and what kind of government eventually takes shape before it steps in and starts talking about improving relations with the government of Sri Lanka. Now, at the moment, what you have is a prime minister who has become a president, has been elected president, but his position is not secure, because while Gotabaya has left, Mahinda Rajapaksa is still in Sri Lanka, And it appears that they are still powerful behind the scenes. And so what they're doing now is that the newly elected president is working as a front for them. And it's tragic that this largely peaceful revolution is being now sought to be put down by force by the government. Now, this is not the kind of reaction that a government that has just been sworn in should resort to at a time when the people themselves are facing huge economic hardship because of the misgovernance of the Rajapaksas, and in which the last few months even Wickremesinghe was involved.
One of the things you've said is precisely the question that we are raising on the program today, that are we actually looking at a new president and prime minister who are proxies for the Rajapaksas? Do you think that, Ambassador Sinha?
Yes, I think so, because in the parliament, the party that belong of the Rajapaksas is still in power. As your friend mentioned from Sri Lanka, Mr. Wickremesinghe had never won he had in fact lost the parliamentary election and was elected through the other system of the national list. So he doesn't have any support within the house from his party. Essentially, he's been elected on the support of the party of the Rajapaksas, and he holds office because of their support. So it appears today that this tactics he's adopting is what Rajapaksas would have done, but for the fact that over the last 2-3 months, when the people revolted, President Gotabaya could not use force because his army refused to fire upon their colleagues, because the deprivation that the people are facing today, as I said, because of the misgovernance in the country, is a genuine thing where everybody is suffering. And in this situation, it is important for any government that is elected to deal with the people a lot more sympathetically than it is doing today.
Meenakshi, you're just back from Sri Lanka. From a human rights perspective, what are your concerns at this point? Hang on, Meenakshi's on mute. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you. It's. I came back yesterday, and by then the president had already been elected, and what we were seeing in the protest site is that people were leaving. They were already saying that there has to be some window given. A lot of protesters were continuing, and they were saying that they wanted to get rid of Ranil, but a large chunk were also saying that they did not. They wanted to give the government a chance. The international community was very keen that the crux of the problem really is the economy. There are miles and miles of vehicles waiting for fuel. There are people who are who are waiting for medicines. There is a humanitarian crisis looming. There are food shortages looming, and the hope was that Ranil Wickremesinghe was going to focus on addressing those problems. Instead, the first thing that he does is to go after the protesters. As Jehan said, these are protesters that, in effect, have brought Ranil Wickremesinghe to office because he doesn't even have the votes in parliament. He has arrived, he's taken office on the back of the Rajapaksa party, the SLPP. And it has to be said that the SLPP is extremely unpopular, that the Rajapaksas are extremely unpopular for poor governance, for vanity projects, for pushing the country into a debt crisis where they have now defaulted on their loans. There is everybody is waiting for shipments from India, because that is what is, and India has played an extremely important role in keeping the supply lines open. But what Sri Lanka needs right now is a focus on economic and social reform. It needs accountability. The protesters were holding up banners saying, "Bring our money home," because there's been so much corruption. There is the people in the north are still waiting for accountability for war crimes that were conducted under these same Rajapaksa brothers. And yet, this is what Ranil Wickremesinghe does. This becomes his priority. It is utterly, utterly shameful.
So, Padma, what happens next? How long can Sri Lanka afford to remain in this sort of turmoil? You have Fidel talking about fatigue among the protesters, but there's also the extraordinary geopolitical impact. China Foreign Policy has a brilliant article on how China not just funded infrastructure in Sri Lanka for influence, but actually personally funded the Rajapaksas over the years, including scandals around donations being given to family members of the Rajapaksas. And now China has just decided to, in a sense, now seek to dehyphenate itself, not just from the Rajapaksas, but from Sri Lanka. India has a credit line open, is coming to the aid of the Sri Lankan people. But the CIA chief in the last 24 hours is talking about what he called Sri Lanka's dumb bets on China. Padma?
Yeah, if I may just digress a little bit because I have been listening to the other speakers. I completely agree with Jehan. As anybody in their right mind would, I absolutely condemn the violence that took place in the wee hours today. Having said that, since you mentioned China, since you mentioned, we talked about the movement at length, there is no need for violence, but let's, as Fidel pointed out, I think Ranil Wickremesinghe, even as acting president, had made clear one thing, that he already imposed an emergency even as acting president, even before he took oath, as after he was elected. So, and why did he do that? Because these protests have been absolutely right, 99% very peaceful protests, but there has been an element of anarchy, of violence, of vandalism. People have been there have been individual politicians who have been attacked. There has been vandalism on public property. There has been the destruction, the gutting of somebody's personal house, that is the Prime Minister's personal residence. Now let's not brush those under the carpet. There has been that. Now, no government. The second point I'd like to make is that, look, we're all talking so much about how the Rajapaksas are hated. Please tell me, Barkha, just 2 years ago in 2019, it is the same nation of 22 million who voted them back resoundingly to power. More than 52% of the vote share was given to Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Now, you may say the very same people, they voted him then because of the failures of the previous government. The very same people want him out now. Well, if you voted somebody in, you have to vote them out again. You can't take to the streets and, declare yourself the president, the prime minister. I mean, and you see, the other thing is about the protests. I'll come to the protest. I'm sorry, the attack in the morning today. The feedback I'm getting from people, a few people I'm speaking to in Colombo, are saying, they're indicating that there were perhaps some sort of intelligence reports received by the army. Again, that does not condone the violence. There should be no need for violence. But they did receive, apparently, reportedly, some intelligence reports that there has been, right from the beginning, behind the vandalism, there have been extreme left-wing Marxist groups. The demonstrators themselves have admitted that in private when I spoke to them, when many of us journalists went there. Now, the latest intelligence reports apparently indicated some such forthcoming disturbance. And if you notice this morning, when the new prime minister was named, Dinesh Gunawardena, who is also a Rajapaksa and Podujana Peramuna man, again, the protesters around noon today took out a demonstration and said, down with the prime minister and we want him out. So, Barkha, please tell me. I'm trying to understand this. I'm trying to wrap my head around it. I hate the violence. I don't want the protests, which are 99% peaceful, which are an admirable, torch to society all over the world. I don't want that to happen. But tell me, where is the constitutionality? Constitutionality means if you vote somebody in, you vote them out. I agree. Sri Lanka cannot have elections right now. It is broke. But you went through a constitutional procedure of naming a president. It was on full public view. It was televised on every channel. Sorry. So I'm winding up. I just want to say that. And the other thing is, a very last point I want to make. For all the people who say that, we loved Podujana Peramuna 2 years ago, now saying that we hate Podujana Peramuna today, that's fine. Okay, you have every right to hate them and remove them. They're not my uncles or my cousins. But what I must say is, please note, there is an intriguing divide within the Podujana Peramuna itself. The foreign minister, practically the entire cabinet that was elected this morning was the same cabinet as before, most of it. G.L. Pires, the professor who was a long-standing foreign minister of this country, was not elected back as foreign minister. In his place came Ali Sabri, right? So there is a rift because G.L. Pires did not support Ranil Wickremesinghe. There is a rift within the Podujana Peramuna party
but let me step in here to your larger point that, is there is what's happening in Sri Lanka extra constitutional? I don't want to speak for the Sri Lankan people, so I'll bring in our guest from Sri Lanka. Fidel, do you want to take Padma's point that 2 years ago this same set of people were seen differently? That there will come a time when any government will want to try and restore order, that it should have been done peaceably. But how long can these protests carry on? How long can any government in any country allow that kind of unrest on its watch?
So there's a number of things here. First of all, Padma Rao Sundarji is correct. There was a huge mandate for the Gotabaya Rajapaksa presidency and the parliament, which he got. The Podujana Peramunu was essentially able to put together a 2/3 majority in parliament. So 2 years ago, they had a huge mandate. But they also went through substantial shocks to the economy. The 2019 Easter attacks happened, on the back of which Gotabaya Rajapaksa built his presidential candidacy and won. Then the COVID-19 pandemic happened, a further shock to the economy. And during that period, they had made such catastrophic policy errors that people turned resoundingly against them. And people are allowed to change their mind. That can happen in a democracy. People are allowed to change their mind in the masses, which is what we've seen in Sri Lanka. And so, yes, there is, but no one was asking for an extra constitutional. Even the protest movement did not ask for an extra constitutional resolution to the crisis. They asked for the president to resign, which he has. They asked for non-corrupt politicians to be installed in their place. They asked for corruption to be ended. And at no point did any of the protest movement's leaders install themselves or propose themselves as leaders for this. There has been violence that has almost always been instigated by the state. Outside Ranil Wickremesinghe's house on July 9th, journalists were beaten up, as I mentioned earlier, and tear gas has been fired right through the course of this. In Rambukkana, live rounds were shot at a largely peaceful protest, and a man was killed. There were many instances of the state using this violence. On May 9th, a mob that was kind of brought together by Mahinda Rajapaksa's groups then attacked the protesters. All of this stuff, yes, the protests have at times been violent, but the violence has always, the match has always been lit by the state and by the Rajapaksa forces or by whoever controls the government at the time.
Right.
And I think that it is a very important distinction to understand and is important context to bring to the conversation.
And Jehan, the question then would be, what next? What now?
Yeah, what I would anticipate is that the protests will go on. The reason people are protesting is that 3 years ago, when they voted for the Rajapaksas, the people were living in an upper middle income country by World Bank's assessment. They were told by the Rajapaksas that we still face a big security threat that comes from our minorities, our Tamils and our Muslims, and from the external world. So please vote for us. We will protect you and protect your way of life. 3 years later, the people find that their living standards have fallen by 1/2, that there are lines outside petrol stations where thousands of vehicles are parked for 5-6 days with drivers in them. People like me are in those vehicles 5-6 days. And that is why they are now protesting. That's why they came out in the large number. In any other country, any other decent country, the leaders would resign. Leaders who ruin the agriculture by declaring that fertilizer should not be purchased, banned the use of fertilizer, chemical fertilizer overnight, and wrecked our agriculture, would have resigned. Anyone would have resigned. Our leaders have not resigned. They are not taking responsibility. So what else can the people do? Are they to now wait another 2.5 years with these people who they believe sincere? They believe these people have robbed them. And we know that there is an extraordinary large amount of corruption in our country. And earlier we knew that they were corrupt. Not only the Rajapaksas, not only this government, but previous governments. But our previous governments also delivered something, at least to the ethnic majority, at least the Sinhalese, so that the Sinhalese living standard was increasing. Now the Sinhalese majority realizes that they were duped. And that's what these people are saying on the streets. I was very happy. As a member of our peace movement, ethnic peace movement, I was very happy when they said, we are Sinhalese, Tamils, Muslims, we are equal citizens in our country. We will not be tricked anymore by our politicians who want our votes to hate each other. And they actually tried very hard to be nonviolent. And some of this violence, I believe.
I think Jehan's line has gone off just on cue. And I just want to say that there was no power, electricity where he is, and he's using his emergency lights to join us. He's back. I'll let you complete your point. Yeah, go ahead, Jehan. Can you hear me? If you can, please complete your point, Jehan.
Yeah. So anyway, what we need to do, I'm sorry because the power thing situation, what we need to do, the people will continue to protest. I believe that the young people and all those who support them will come out again on the streets. It's going to be a confrontation, because this time, unlike Gotabaya, who probably was a little frightened to use the military because he's already accused of war crimes, he knows that the international community is gunning for him. Ranil Wickremesinghe, because of his good reputation, is not so much afraid. And I think he believes in a more clinical approach to governance. So I'm really worried this time when we defy a curfew, what will happen to us? I'm not sure anymore. But people will go out.
Yeah, I want to take that to Meenakshi before I come to Ambassador Sinha. The Sri Lanka military, as I said, had desisted from being involved in any position that put them into confrontation with protesters. That seems to be changing, is what we're hearing from our Sri Lankan friends. But from Padma comes the question, how long can a protest in fact carry on? How long can it carry on? And if an election can't be held at this moment, what are the alternatives?
Well, two different things. How long can a protest carry on? I think already the protesters had said that they were going to disperse, which is why it is so shocking. They were going to disperse at 2 p.m. today. So why was the military sent in at dawn? It doesn't make any sense. And it was quite brutal. People were beaten up, and the anxiety with which they seem to have grabbed phones to dissuade people from taking pictures of the operation also suggests that perhaps they themselves were a bit concerned about the allegations that will come up of excessive use of force, which is what has occurred. In terms of, where this all lands, the truth is that there is a very severe crisis. The Sri Lanka is, as Jehan just pointed out, it was an upper middle income country. In South Asia, the parameters, the indicators that Sri Lanka had were really superior. And to see this country fall apart, to a large part, is misgovernance. Now, when there is misgovernance like this, then you cannot wait for the government to still for a election to take place. Political leaders have to take themselves into account. The military, you're right, did not initially support any kind of crackdown. They even refused, partly because their own brothers, their own cousins are in those lines. There are veterans who were part of the protest. There were disabled veterans who were part of on the protest side. In fact, I think one of the tents was broken today during this crackdown. The military is, the security forces will eventually have to do what they're ordered to do, but there is no popular support for this kind of excessive use of force, this kind of abusive action. And as Jehan earlier said, this is something that has actually finally brought a very ethnically divided country together. The Rajapaksas have forever tried to pitch Muslims against the Sinhala Buddhists, would not even allow the burial of Muslims if they died of COVID. We, of course, know of the war that ended in 2009 and the thousands of Tamil civilians who were killed in that military action, for which the Rajapaksas are accused of war crimes. So at this point of time, the military would have wanted to be careful about being a rights-respecting force, but they do respond to the executive presidency. And Ranil Wickremesinghe, under the constitution, has absolute authority. Plus, he has emergency powers right now. And it is unfortunate that this is how he has chosen to use it, as opposed to focusing on the needs of the people, which is the social and economic crisis.
Ambassador Sinha, who does India engage with? We had the foreign minister answer parliament and put the details on the financial assistance. I think we have a slide of that somewhere. But who does India actually engage with? Because it is clearly too early to legitimize, as it were, the new president and prime minister. But yet you do need to engage with somebody, even to assist a broken country rebuild itself. Ambassador.
Well, it's very sad that in South Asia, we have just had Afghanistan, where we are dealing with a Taliban government, but providing humanitarian assistance to the people. It's rather tragic that Sri Lanka, which has the highest human development index in South Asia, has fallen to that same situation where we have to deal with whoever is able to take the humanitarian assistance from India and provide it to the people, be it daily necessities like food or fuel. And we just have to do it with whoever can take the equipment from us. Because, again, it's very tragic that it's countries like China that have stepped in and created these crises and then walked away with their debt. All other countries are rescheduling their debt, but China refuses to do so. So India has to step in and provide humanitarian assistance to these countries, which I think we should continue to do, although we don't owe anything either to the Rajapaksas or to any other of the other governments who pursued these policies of hubris in the country.
What concerns you? What concerns you the most right now from a strategic affairs perspective?
Well, what concerns me is that a country as close to us as Sri Lanka and as friendly to us, where the people are extremely friendly with us, are in this state of economic crisis where they are suffering. And what concerns me is that the elected representatives had tried to break up that country through these ethnic differences. And one of the good things about the movement, as has been pointed by your other panelists, is that those separatist forces have not raised their head in the agitation, which is what normally happens in a country which goes through an economic crisis. That's a very healthy and a very happy sign. And I hope the elected representatives don't hide behind their constitutional powers and treat their responsibility with a little bit of humility, and the fact that they hold these powers in trust to the people. And if there is genuine crisis, they must sit down and, instead of looking at the nuts and bolts of the constitution, try and find a way in which they can solve the problems. If it may, and India, of course, should continue to help whoever is able to take the humanitarian assistance from us.
Yeah. So, Padma, here's the question to you then. I mean, is democracy defined by results of an election, or is it defined by what happens between elections? That's the question at this point. As Jehan said, what happens when they step out, defying a curfew, or defying restrictions, and come face to face with an army now tasked with stopping or ending these protests? And Wickremesinghe, sorry, just one sentence more, may have given a new lease of life to protests that were scheduled to end anyway.
Okay, I am not, I don't intend to play agent provocateur, but I really need to address some of the points that have been raised before I come to your question. Some of the demands, I just wanted to tell Fidel, some of the demands being raised by the protesters, Fidel, were certainly, not very, they were not very constitutional. I mean, everybody, they wanted practically everybody to resign. That's accepted. You want everybody to resign. You wanted them in for 2 years ago. You want them out now. That's fine. That can be accepted. But how and then you said that every bit of violence that happened was in response to something else. The one wrong doesn't condone the right, and yet I'll say that, okay, fine, the army and the police always have the upper hand. So if some journalists were beaten up outside Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe's house, then the protesters had every right to gut his house down. Fine, let's leave that as it is. Jehan suggests that leaders should have resigned. Tell me, Jehan, with a $51 billion external debt, can you afford an immediate election? If the leaders had resigned, let's say each and every one of them had resigned, what would have been inevitable? Inevitable would have been an election, right? You are a democracy. What else, which other path could you have taken? You could not have existed in a vacuum. And if not, what was the solution? The opposition was offered please remember, Jehan, the opposition, Sajid Premadasa, was offered the role of in an interim government even when Gotabaya was there. He turned it down. And then he accepted after it had been given to Ranil. Presidential candidate, again, he said, I'll run for president. Then he turned it down. Each and every one of even those people who are supporting the protests, the opposition politicians, have also by and large kept their own political futures in mind, because nobody wanted to take on this unpopular job of leading, a country out of this huge economic mess, undoubtedly created primarily by the Rajapaksas. This is not about pro or contra the Rajapaksas. Now, so the thing is that so Sajid turned all that down. Then I wanted to ask Meenakshi. Meenakshi said, you can't afford to wait for an election to take place. Then what? What then is the solution, Meenakshi? If you can't wait for an election to take place, so people should keep, basically just keep streaming out on the streets and protesting. What do you suggest? Who is going to talk to the IMF? Who is going to conduct bilateral talks with each of the lender countries to restructure their debts? Who is going to take any position of authority? Please tell me. Do you see, even the Aragalaya movement, which is a fantastic public movement, as I said right in the beginning, only came out with 4 or 5 visible leaders about 3 days ago or 4 days ago. Up to then, we did not know whether this movement had coalesced. Can I please finish, Barkha? I was waiting for everybody to finish.
Sure.
Till that point in time, this movement had not even coalesced and come together into a movement with a joint, kind of with people who are leading the movement. So I just want to know, all these are things that we all like to say, and I'm equally agonized by the violence. But how can a country exist in a political vacuum? And did any of the opposition politicians offer to step in and take on that role? How can you afford elections if you have a $51 billion debt? Who is going to fill the vacuum? That is the question that is topmost on my mind. As far as what Ambassador said, very last thing to the strategic concerns, I think that it is admirable seeing what that India is doing so much, that India has given them bridge financing and all kinds of support for 4 billion. India is offering to do more. And I think India has kept admirably out of the whole, it is not going to indulge in any kind of getting involved in Sri Lankan domestic affairs ever again. It's burnt its fingers once. But the question again is, whom is India going to negotiate with? Let's be practical. Whom are you going to negotiate with?
That was in fact the question I asked, but I did hear Ambassador Sinha say we have to talk to whoever's there for the sake of the people. But I think you have specific questions for Jehan and Meenakshi, so I want to take them to first Jehan and then Meenakshi. Jehan, go ahead. Who, if not this government? Who, if not this set of people?
What has been proposed and what Gotabaya accepted, and I believe Ranil Wickremesinghe too, is an interim all-party government for a short period with a few ministers, hand-picked ministers selected from all parties, to negotiate with the IMF, to sort out our problems, then hold elections, and also to have a referendum at the end of that period on whether we want this executive presidency to stay or go. That would be the way forward, I believe.
Okay, Meenakshi? Meenakshi, can you hear us? Meenakshi is on mute.
Sorry, I'm unmuted now. All right, sorry. The thing is that all along, the trust deficit of the ruling administration had to be taken into account. You're right, Padma, that most political leaders did not want to take the hot potato of an economic crisis. They would have come up to the leadership role if there had been a trust-based interim arrangement which would have negotiated with the IMF, would have solved the immediate crisis leading up to the election. Ranil Wickremesinghe's first thing should have been to go back to the 19th Amendment. See, there are things that he could have done which were the rights-respecting approaches, as opposed to the first thing that he does is crack down on protesters. The protesters were not an immediate threat in any form. I don't know what intelligence reports you have heard, but I promise you I was there on the ground. No one was plotting to do anything. They were all leaving. They had already said that they were leaving at 2 o'clock. So therefore, this was not the priority. It is very clear what the priority is. It is people who need medicines. It is people in the countryside that need food. It is people that need fuel. It is Jehan who needs electricity in his house. He has priorities. Cracking down on a bunch of kids was not the priority. The fact that he chose to do this within 24 hours of taking the presidency is shocking.
Padma, you want to briefly respond, and then I want to go to Ambassador Sinha. By the way, we keep losing Fidel also for the same reasons, and I'm not even trying to sanitize that, because I think it's important to know the circumstances in which our Sri Lankan guests are joining us. Padma, very briefly, please, then Ambassador
Very
Sinha.
briefly, very briefly. I mean, I think we're going round in circles. Everybody agrees that people want the Rajapaksas out. Everybody agrees that an interim administration should have been formed. Everybody agrees. There is no disagreement on those matters at all. I'm merely saying that I'm asking you to point out to me 5 people or 2 people or one person, either in the opposition or in the ruling party or in its its less hated affiliates in its coalition. It is a ruling coalition. Please point me to one person who stepped forward and said, I am willing to take this on. Now, as far as the interim administration is concerned, Jehan is absolutely right. And I said that before. There was an offer of an interim administration, but then they said, we will not do it under Gotabaya Rajapaksa. Days after saying that, Sajid Premadasa came back and said, actually, I will take it on under certain conditions. By then it was too late. Presidential candidature, same thing. Initially, he said, I'll run for president. I'm going to pull out this country out of this mess.
Okay.
A day later, he said, I don't want to do it. So the thing is that you name, I'm willing to go with anything at all to pull this wonderful country out of this mess. But name, we're sitting here and mouthing platitudes. Who is going to take it on? Meenakshi, I've covered Sri Lanka on the ground all through May when the riots, when the disturbances were happening on the ground, when Mahinda had just exited, and all those things happened. I've been hanging out with the protesters. I've spoken to them extensively. So it's not as if I'm sitting here and relying on flaky intelligence reports.
Can I place your question?
I'm also quoting people directly, people I spoke to.
Yeah. Okay, Fidel, I don't know if you managed to catch some of the debate that's going on, but if you just want to respond to some of the points raised by Padma, and then I'll give the ambassador the last word. Fidel? And Fidel, you're muted. Can you unmute yourself, please? If you can hear me. Fidel?
Sure. Yes, hi, you can hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
You can hear me?
Yes.
Hello?
We can.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
You
if
can
you
hear
can
me
see
now?
me, we can hear you.
Hello?
Okay. I don't think you
Yeah,
can hear
okay.
us. If you can, make your point.
So, I
Yes.
mean, there are a couple of things there. I think the first thing is that there can be no political stability and there can be no economic stability without political legitimacy. And that is the main thing that the protest movement has asked for, that people have asked for. And I know I'm on a bit of a lag here, but in the end, I think that what had been asked for was for the old style of doing politics in Sri Lanka to go. And Ranil Wickremesinghe, Gotabaya Rajapaksa, all of those people had been this past political establishment that people have taken aim at. And while that is still standing, and Ranil Wickremesinghe is still, is someone who's been in politics for 45 years, who many see as having poisoned Sri Lankan politics for many generations. The Rajapaksa is the same thing. So while those people are still standing, there can be no stability in which to negotiate a better economy for Sri Lanka. And
yeah, I think the question being asked, I know you're on a dodgy line in Sri Lanka, power, electricity, internet. We lost Fidel as he was trying to make that point. Jehan, if you wanted to complete that point for him, and then I will bring in the ambassador for the last word to what Padma raised.
Well, we had an alternative. We had a candidate, Dallas Alhaperuma and Sajid Premadasa. They were defeated. They were defeated by a majority in parliament, a 2/3 majority that had been elected 3 years ago, which the people have rejected now, whose mandate has been nullified. That's why we said, don't go for a vote in parliament. It's a legal parliament for sure. It's an illegitimate one, morally illegitimate. Instead, all the political party leaders get together and select a consensus candidate. That's what we want, and a consensus cabinet. And I guess they failed. They failed at that.
Yeah, yeah. Ambassador, to the last word to you and to some specific sort of questions from Padma, who says, what is the mechanism? In the interim, what is the mechanism?
Well, I don't think anybody can have the last word right now in this very fast evolving situation. But I must point out here that while Sri Lanka's economic situation is clearly very bad, its political situation is really not all that bad. Remember, the revolution, in most revolutions, after a few months, degenerates either into civil war or into tyranny. Now, Sri Lanka has not yet degenerated, fortunately, into either of these two situations. The agitation remains peaceful, and the government is still kind of functioning because the parliament is there. The parliament managed to elect a new president. And now it is for the new president to rise to the occasion. If he does that, then he can become a savior. Whatever his past be, whatever has happened. Now, if he has a little bit of humility, starts talking to the opposition parties. Now, parties always have their differences. If we go back to India in 1991, you remember parties didn't get together. And they have to get together today, along with the agitators, ask for a bit of time so the agitators can withdraw and let the IMF come in, negotiate with the IMF. There are very difficult decisions to be taken. The last government had doubled Sri Lanka's foreign debt in 2-3 years because of hubris and because of all kinds of fanciful projects. All that has to be paid for. Now the time has come to pay the bill. But Ranil Wickremesinghe today has this position. If he rises to the occasion, he'll become a savior. If he doesn't, then I don't know whether somebody else will rise to the occasion or not. But certainly, I think so far the position has been quite stable. The country is still peaceful. I think that is how the country should move. Sri Lanka is the best educated country in South Asia, and it must take that lead in that it can handle its internal situation politically and with the great deal of sobriety and peacefully.
And may Sri Lanka Center continue to hold in the way that you suggest, but to the point that it was Ranil Wickremesinghe's moment to make something out of this, out of this responsibility to lead his nation out of the shadows. I think that is why the puzzlement as to why his very first decision, and that black box you see there, the Sri Lankan guest losing his internet, would not be to focus on those things, on electricity, power, food, medicines, provide drugs to hospitals, and instead to crack down on protesters who had said that they would leave anyway. That surely is the bottom line, at least for today. Thank you very much, Ambassador Sinha, Meenakshi, Ganguly, Padma Rao, and to our guests from Sri Lanka, unable to join us in the last minutes of this program. That visual of the black box telling its own story there, Jehan, Perera, and Fidel. Thank you so much, and to our audience, see you tomorrow, same time. Thanks for watching. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.